First, a reminder of your geography. In this new and, what have I done? In this new and colorful map, we are in, the map calls it Macedonia and Achaia. The Romans called it Thessaly. And it's no surprise that the city is called Thessalonia, to which we spent a good deal of time. But we've gone south into Achaia and come to Corinth. The book of Acts tells us of Paul's traveling through northern Greece and then southern Greece, and the founding of the churches, a whole raft of churches in Greece. We customarily date his visit to that part of Greece somewhere between the years 49 and 52. This is Paul's second mission journey. And although we are about to read Paul's presence in Corinth, as we find it in his first letter to the Corinthians, if you were reading in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, you would describe it's not his first letter. He mentions a letter he had already written to them. Chapter 5, verse 9. And I'd like to leave you nice and well confused. If you wanted to, you could call this Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, the first one not surviving. But what do we do with 2 Corinthians in the canon? Well, let me make it even more confusing. 2 Corinthians may be a collection of 4 letters of Paul. There's a big dispute about it, and it's not a dispute that we could solve or we need to solve. Because at least our 1 Corinthians, which I'm now calling 2 Corinthians, our 1 Corinthians is a single letter, with possibly a couple of later inclusions. When you've been exposed long enough to the New Testament, you'll discover that across the almost 300 years before this is put together as a single book, there were all sorts of inclusions made in the documents. If we were reading the Gospel according to John together, you'd discover that after you got to finished with chapter 13 in the Gospel of John, you've arrived to 3 chapters that don't make any sense in the sequence. And you will finally discover that the Gospel according to John is the result of at least 3 hands, if not 4, and thus the inclusions. So don't be too surprised if Paul's canonical second letter to the Corinthians is a collection of letters. It's valuable to know that because it will tell us much more about the context in which Paul is writing. And it's the context we're concerned with here. You'll remember that Corinth is a good and important city. It's the capital of what the Romans called the southern province. Sometimes they use the word diocese, which you may recognize. We also use. Not a modern term. It's the way the Romans, in their vast empire, organized it geographically. Be that as it may, Corinth is the capital of that province called Achaia. I hazard the guess that it's got at least 100,000 people in it. It's an extremely important city because of its location. And if you look on your map, as I think we have already done, you will see that it's on a little piece of land called an isthmus. I think I mentioned to you last week that it was such an important commercial city and provided a way around the wicked waters of the Aegean and then the Mediterranean, that Nero tried to build a canal across it. Well, 15 miles of canal, he didn't succeed. But if you were to go to Corinth today, you would find it's largely an archaeological site. And if you were to walk outside the city to the north slightly, you'd find an old Roman road over which people would carry the material shipped into the port of Corinth all the way across to the Aegean, all 15 miles of it. As a matter of fact, if you looked carefully at the road, you would see that some of those loads are pretty heavy because the wheels have made inroads into the road. In any case, it's an important city, a busy city. It was destroyed in the year 146, and the Romans did not rebuild it until the year 46 before our era. So when Paul gets to it, it's only about 100 years old, not quite. And it's a Roman city. And it's largely an archaeological site today. You can go and check the houses and some of the public squares and so forth and get a sense of really what it was like in those days, in Paul's days. The important thing that I want to mention, however, is that it has in the middle of it a huge thing called the Acrocorinth. It's a huge rock tower that goes up, on the top of which is a temple to the great Greek goddess Aphrodite. Aphrodite is the goddess of love. On the top of the mountain is her temple. As a matter of fact, if you were wandering around Greece even today, you would discover that the tops of mountains often have temples on them. And there's a very good reason for it. Because in antiquity, the divinities, the gods, were all in the sky. And when they came to earth, they needed a place where earth and sky, and they put it this way, kissed. It was the top of these tall mountains. Mount Olympus is famous, not because of its games, because of its height, and the fact that it's there that the Olympian gods came down onto earth. So in Corinth, Aphrodite's temple is where she resided and took care of the city. There were two other deities in Corinth that were important for us. One of them is the goddess Demeter. She's the goddess of the agricultural fields, which would suggest to you that a number of the Corinthians earned their livelihood through agriculture. Another god or deity was Poseidon. He's the God of the oceans and the depths, which should suggest to you that part of Corinth depended upon shipping and the oceans. And we will encounter in a few minutes the importance of Aphrodite in our city. So there is Corinth in a brief sketch, a home of very important divinities, and because of that home, we learn a great deal about the people and the economy. Economy comes from a Greek word, oikonomeo. It means how you rule your house. And so, how did the Corinthians rule their houses? We're about to see it was quite a place. First and foremost, we saw in the Thanksgiving that the community was endowed, the Christians there. I do not know how many there would have been. If there were 100,000 people in Corinth, I'd hazard the guess that it couldn't have been more than about 50. Maybe 4 or 5, shall I call them household communities? I call them household communities because Paul does. And he tells you there are a number of them, and you know the name of 5 of them. Apollos is one of them. He has a group. And then there are a group of Christians that are in a household that is devoted to Peter. And another one devoted to Paul. And another devoted to one of 2 synagogue heads, Sosthenes. And another, Cyrus. Very interesting that we learn that, because they were heads of synagogues, and here they are, heads now of household communities, or as Paul calls them, churches. He's the one, Paul, who names these communities. We might call them permanently. They are ecclesia. That is to say, they are made up of people called out by God. I think I've mentioned this before when we were in Thessalonica, that in a Greek city, the citizens, that is to say, the adult male freemen of the city, the citizens were convoked. They were called out to meet and pass regulations for the running of the city. That, shall we call it, political enterprise was called by the Greeks ecclesia. Those called out, the convoked. And Paul is using that term for these households. They're convoked. How and by whom? By God and Christ. And Paul consistently comes back to that. In fact, in this letter, towards the end of it, Paul calls those households the body of Christ. He wants to make that identification without question. But be that as it may, our concern is with what's going on there. And we learn right away in the first chapter from a group called Chloe's people. I assume that Chloe had a household. And if that's true, as is true elsewhere, women were leaders in the church as well. It was her household, her people, Paul tells us, that we learn that there are quarrels in the community, quarrels between these households. And we learn that there are some devotees of Paul. Let's call it the Pauline household. It may have been more than one, but there's this Paul community. Another one is the community of a man called Apollos. He appears to have originally been an Alexandrian Jew whom Paul met in Rome and who was thrown out of Rome along with the Jews about Paul's time. A couple of other Jews appear in Paul's letters. Aquila and Priscilla. Priscilla is often known as Prisca. In any case, these are people that end up in Paul's world because they were thrown out by Nero, thrown out of the city. In any case, we learn from Chloe's people that there are all sorts of quarrels. My translation, which is the New Revised Standard, calls them quarrels. The Greek word for it is a word that you actually know. You'd be amazed at how much Greek you actually know. The word in the text is schismata. In English, schisms. Our translators, I don't know altogether why, call them quarrels. Actually, they're sharper than that. How sharp, I don't know. Whether the kind of term, whether it's the term that we would use about the schism created in 1054 between the Eastern Christian communities and the Western Christian communities, I think that's probably too sharp a translation. But still, these are sharp differences with, let's call it, it's a quarrel with elbows in it. In any case, we learn of the households. We learn something else in the early parts of the chapter. We learn that there are a whole series of people who claim wisdom. I think we mentioned last week that the Greek term for wisdom is Sophia. Do we have any Sophies in the room? Too bad. Wisdom, Sophia. There are a group of people, and this tells you something about Corinth. There are a group of people who, what shall I call them? Well, we've met them before in Thessalonica, and we met them because in Roman cities there appear to be groups of people, offshoots from the philosophical schools in Rome and Athens, especially Athens, but also in Rome. Philosophical schools. And you know the names of some of them. Well, some of them may even be your neighbors, cynics. There are a variety of different schools. Stoics is another. And like Paul, they travel around to the Greeks and Roman cities. And they do so in order to spread their vision of wisdom. I think we've looked at this before slightly, but it's probably worth reminding us ourselves. We think of ourselves as made up of body and soul, right? The Greeks and Romans had a somewhat different way of being made up. We are made up of, and you find this term so often in Paul, flesh, for which the Greek term is sarx, and Paul uses it throughout, not only Corinthians and the dozens of letters he wrote. You're made up, you and I are made up, we would call them bodily. They simply called it flesh. The most obvious part of us. And in our flesh are ways of motion. I'm moving my flesh. Well, who is the I that's moving my flesh? Or who's blinking your eye when the light gets too much? Or who causes you a headache? For the Greeks and Romans, it was, and I don't know how to translate this, but I'll try. It's the operating self. There's an aspect of each of us that operates our flesh. Sometimes it's conscious, like I move my finger, but when you blink your eye, it's probably not conscious. The Greeks had a wonderful word for it. It was what they called the psyche. In English, we call it my psyche. We just transliterate it. It's this operating self. It's not altogether flesh, but it's in the flesh, and it moves it. So far, so good. We're flesh and psyche. Usually, English speakers translate psyche as soul. And you can almost hear the transliteration in it. But let's keep it at psyche. Because there's another aspect of us, the real self. My real self and your real self, the Greeks and the Romans called it pneuma. Spirit, we translate it spirit. That's the real self. Now let me put this back in context in Corinth. Let's say a Stoic comes to the city. And he finds himself some eager audience, and they discover, and the reason for their interest is that he claims to help you discover your real self. Your real self, which you got to find it within the flesh and within your psyche. Your real self is your pneuma, a term which Paul regularly uses. It won't surprise you that in Pauline letters, you discover that God has a pneuma. It's translated spirit. And it's usually a little phrase called the Spirit of Holiness. And spirit seeks to translate a Hebrew term, ruach, which simply means breath. So if you are presently breathing, that's your real self, a sign of your real self. And the Spirit of holiness is God's way of entering into the world and into the lives of people in that world. It is, to put it in another way of translation, his intimate and active presence, for which the Bible has a term, God's Shekinah. And if you're familiar with the book of Exodus, in fact, all 5 of the Torah books, you'll find that God's intimate and active presence dwells in the midst of the Israelites. In fact, that's the function of his temple. That's his dwelling place, out of which he works to persuade the Israelites to pursue the goal which he, God, has in mind for them. It's this intimate and active presence that's so prominent in Paul's letters. That's the Spirit of holiness. It's often translated the Holy Spirit. And I use the term Spirit of holiness because you don't find Holy Spirit in the Greek text. You find the term holy as an adjective for the Spirit. The reason I kind of resist calling it Holy Spirit is this. That's reading Paul's letters with the eyes of the Council of Constantinople that formulated the doctrine of the Trinity. The date of that council is 381. It's quite legitimate for people to read back into the New Testament this doctrine of the Trinity, that the Holy Spirit is this third person of the Trinity active in Paul's letters. But that's not the way Paul's people would have understood it. It's the intimate and active presence of God. 300 and some years later, defined as the third person of the Godhead. Why do I take that amount of time to explain all that? Because these people, non-Pauline preachers, shall we call them, I've called some of them Stoics, some of them cynics, and so forth. It would be better if I called them sophists. They come preaching a wisdom, the wisdom that will allow you to discover your true self. And that involves you being very disciplined. You have to be able to control your flesh and the operating drives that make that flesh move. To the extent that you do not control them, according to a sophist, you will not find your real self. This kind of sophistry is not a complimentary term anymore, but it was then. This kind of sophistry influenced Paul a great deal. He talks consistently in this letter and in the other letters about controlling the flesh. In fact, the rest of that letter, after about the 4th chapter, is all about, what shall we call them? The flesh and the suke. When you finally got into the 5th chapter in Paul's first letter, you discover that there are serious problems in the Christian communities of Corinth. Aside from the, what shall we call it, the factionalism, or the schisms, aside from that, there's a problem of sexual immorality. Paul uses the term of sexual immorality. He uses the term porneia. We use it too in the word called pornography. We borrowed it maybe from Paul. Actually, I suspect we borrowed it simply from the Greeks. Sexual immorality for Paul is porneia. And listen to the kind of thing that's going on among these nice Corinthian people. I'm in chapter 5. He's saying to them, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. Porneia, right? And of a kind that is not found even among the pagans. That's my translation. That's the translation in the New Revised Standard. The actual word in the text means the nations. And Paul is a Jew. There's Israel and the Jews over here. And those who are not Jews, they're called the nations. Or in Latin, the gens, or in English, the Gentiles. The world is composed of Gentiles and Jews. That's Paul's world, okay? In any case, it's not found even among the Gentiles or pagans, for a man is living with his father's wife. And you are arrogant. That's my translation. The Greek is a much more colorful word. And you're puffed up. Literally, that's what the term in the text is. You're puffed up, you're arrogant. Should you not rather have mourned so that he who has done this would have been removed from among you? It appears that this man is having a sexual life with his father's second wife, or his stepmother. And even the Corinthian Gentiles wouldn't allow that. But the community apparently is doing so. For though absent in the body, I am present in spirit. And as if present, I have already pronounced judgment. This is nice old Paul, okay? In the name of the Lord Jesus, on the man who has done such a thing. When you are assembled, ecclesia, okay? Called out, convoked. And my spirit is present with the power of the Lord Jesus. You are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. Now you will remember that that's Paul's customary way of speaking of the last day. This is the earliest record I've ever found in Christian literature for excommunication. You're to throw him out of the community. That's what excommunication means. That's rather a striking statement of a problem he's got. And the problem is really the problem that he's consistently faced in the city of Corinth. You see, Aphrodite is the goddess of love. And she has a community. The Greeks would call it a cult. And it's made up of prostitutes. The Aphrodite worshippers are all prostitutes. And that's simply way up here. The sexual morality of the city was influenced by Aphrodite and all sorts of other things. And that's going to be a primary problem for Paul in the city of Corinth. And if you read the letter, you'll discover that it continually comes up in the following chapters. I bring it to your attention so that you'll know one of the reasons why this is a troubled community. They didn't do anything about this guy. And now, in a letter form, he's demanding that they throw him out of the community. He'll do that again in other communities. He says, I don't want you associating with people like that. But don't get me wrong, I don't mean that you can't associate with the immoral people of the world, and by world he means Corinth in this case. He means that you cannot adopt their customs and think then you can retain your presence in the community. So it's all right to associate with the immoral of this world. I mean, you live in Corinth, and it's this terrible, immoral city. Among the things that we've already learned in a previous chapter about the people of Corinth is that they like what my translation calls spectacles. But the Greek for that is a nice Greek word that you all know. It's theatroi, theater. Theater is not as good a translation as we might use. A better translation in Corinth and the other cities, the other Greek cities, and most Roman cities, would be amphitheater. The most famous of the amphitheaters is one you can go to. Well, you can't go today because you've got to go to Rome. It's called the Colosseum. A more interesting amphitheater is, well, in a less traveled part of the world, but not untraveled, it's off the Rhone River. It's a city called Arles. If you were to get a boat and go down the river to the Mediterranean, you'd come to Arles and you'd hop off the boat and you'd come into the center of the city. And you would find there the governing palace, happens to be the place for the city administration today. You'd find a bishop's palace built there, in the 500s, 600s. And right near them, once you'd wandered through them, you'd come to a place called the Arena. Still called that, Arena, even by the French. It's an amphitheater. Arena is the Latin word for sand. A curious name for an important place like an amphitheater. If you were to walk inside, you'd discover that the flat part of the amphitheater was all sand. And you might ask, why sand? Well, you see, you'd have these pitched battles with animals. Sometimes you'd have pitched battles with soldiers, some with criminals. Why the sand? Sand soaks blood up. And so they call it the arena. You might not want to call our local baseball fields arenas anymore for that reason. But that's the way things were in big cities. Sometimes they were built what we would call theaters. Now, what went on in them was not exactly what the Governor's School of Arts would play for you. In fact, most of the theatrics were pretty athletic. I mean, you might see, in Corinth, you might see Aphrodite jumping off a mountain and landing smack on the sand. You might see all sorts of strange things in what we would call a theater, but should call an amphitheater. In any case, Corinth has these spectacles, and Paul is troubled by them. In addition to these kinds of moral problems, going to the amphitheater, and sexual immorality or porneia, they're bringing their members to the local courts. And Paul is outraged. They bring community members to the judges and courts of what he calls this world. Paul has a vision of two worlds. The world in which God has revealed himself in Jesus of Nazareth, and this world, the world of flesh and psyche. That's this world. And here they're bringing members of the community to the courts of this world, to the judges and to the lawyers of this world. Whereas, he says, in your community you have people of sound judgment who can readily solve the problems that you think are worthy of court action in the city. That prompts him to list 10 people, 10 kinds of people that will not see or inherit the kingdom of God. Let me see if I can find them for you. Let me see as if it's 9. Yeah. Oh yeah, here they are. Okay. In chapter 5, verse 9 and following, I wrote to you in my letter. That's 1 Corinthians, right? I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robbers, or idolaters, since you would then need to go out of the world. But now I am writing you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother and sister, who is sexually immoral, or greedy, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a robber. Do not even eat with such a person. For what have I to do with judging of those from the outside? It is not those who are inside. Is it not those who are inside that you should be judges of? God will judge those outside. So drive out this wicked person from your midst. That's the conclusion of that chapter that he talked about the man who lives with his father's second wife. Then he goes on to speak about the courts. I'm going through these things simply to indicate the situation in Paul's Corinthian communities. Not a quiet group of pious people exactly, just simple Corinthians. In the chapters following the ones that I've just mentioned, 7 to 15, Paul seeks to answer questions raised by the community. Questions about marriage, about intercourse, about divorce, about mixed marriages. You might wonder about mixed marriages. For Paul, they're marriages between one of his community's members and a Gentile, that is to say, a pagan. And he deals with the question, he says, now if the Gentile member of your marriage is willing to live with you and be helpful, stay married. If not, then separation is possible and you may remarry. That's Paul on the subject, at least for the Corinthians. So he talks also about divorce, and basically divorce is out of the question except in these very practical problems, like the mixed marriage. And divorce will be initiated by the husband. Jewish law still is that that's the way divorce is initiated. A woman has to get what is called a get, which will allow for divorce. Now, you may find it strange that Paul has all of these kind of predispositions, because he tells you in this letter, together with a variety of other letters, one that we will see next, the Galatians, that right from the very beginning he was not only a Jew, but a deeply educated and committed Jew. And you have to realize that Paul is no less a Jew for believing Jesus as the Messiah. Others may think he's less a Jew, but Paul doesn't. And he doesn't think his communities are less Jewish for that. That's going to raise a problem that we will see when we come to the Galatians. If this is true, what I've just suggested, then a male becoming a Christian who's not a Jew but a Gentile, must he be circumcised? And we will discover in the letter to the Galatians, this was a bitter, almost crippling problem among these earliest Christians. Whether to be a believer in Jesus the Messiah, you had to become a Jew and to live as a Jew. That is to say, observing all the commitments involved in the covenant. But we'll see that in detail. It, of course, affects the Corinthians as well, but not in the same way. About circumcision, let me see. If you were wandering down the main street in Ephesus, because you can do that, it's just an archaeological site, but it's of all the archaeological sites in Europe, it's the most striking. And the main street is probably as wide as this floor, and it looks like West Freemason Street. You can imagine riding a cart down it. If you've tried to drive down West Freemason Street lately, you'll discover that if my first car was a 1934 Chevrolet. It was 10 years old when I bought it. I paid $400 for it, and I was living in Baltimore. In Baltimore then, all of the streets downtown were cobblestone. Every damn one of them. And everything in this poor old 1934 Chevrolet practically shook off the car. I had a spotlight on it. I don't know how it got the spotlight, but the damn thing fell out simply because the road was so rough. So if you want to try Ephesus, Main Street, and you can't get to Ephesus yet, drive down West Freemason, and hopefully in an old car. I hope you get to the other end of the street. And if you do get to the other end of the street, you might as well push it into the Elizabeth River. In any case, Ephesus. You're walking down the main street, and you look up, and you see this very elegant building. It's still standing. You come closer, and you discover it's the library. And it's a big building and very handsome. There's not much left inside of it, but the outside is still there. And then you look down in Main Street, and you see a footprint going that way. And you wonder what that's about. Then you find another one. If you follow them, you'll end up in the city's bathroom. And I literally mean bathroom. All around the walls, you will find, you'd call them toilets. In the middle, of course, you'll discover where you take a bath. Now, for the Jew, you take a bath without any clothes on. You are obviously circumcised. And this points you out as not really a member of this city. So the Jews of Corinth and a variety of other cities, Roman and Greek, sought a way of mending their circumcision. And there was an operation that would allow them to get their foreskin back. And the reason for it was so they couldn't, in the baths, be identified as Jewish. That comes out in Paul on the subject of circumcision. Circumcision, and what shall I call it? Decircumcision. And then there's the question of virgins. Now, you'll find in Paul's literature, but in Greek literature generally, a young woman could marry, but only when she was at least 12 years old. And a young man could marry a woman only if he were 14 or more. A young woman, until she was 12, was simply considered a virgin.